If you had to describe the movement in the liturgy and the Mass that we go to every Sunday or even every day, what would you say? Would you say it's linear? Would you say it has its ups and downs, its peaks and valleys? Or would you say it's almost like a circle? My name is Jacob Hubbard. This is Incarnate Ministries, brought to you by St. Thomas Aquinas in Pilot Point, Texas. And again, this is the second video in our little mini-series on the spirit of the liturgy by Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. It's an amazing, amazing book, and I highly, highly recommend it. And again, we hope that through these videos, our eyes are opened in new ways so that we can experience the depth and the beauty of the liturgy itself in new and fantastic ways. And so today's topic is on exitus and reditus, and those are Latin words for departure and return. And so the ancient philosophers actually believed that everything could be explained by this cosmology of exitus and reditus. And it was meant to form a circle, right? And so you exit completely and then reach a point where that exit reaches its end, right? And then from that begins the return all the way back to the original point. And so it forms a circle. And they saw that very physically in the cosmos, right? I mean, from the rotation of the stars, from the shape of the sun, and just the spherical nature of the cosmos, right? You look out at the world and it almost appears like it's a sphere, right? And so they really believed that the circle was the interpretive key for the entirety of reality, this theme of exitus and reditus. And so it became Christianized under the philosophy of St. Augustine. And he talks about how life is almost always like this exitus, this kind of exiting, this emptying, and then return from that point back to where we were. But for him, it was always to a deeper level. And I think we can kind of recognize this in our own spiritual lives, that we often deal with a lot of the same issues, but at a deeper level, right? Or we come to the same points in our lives at a deeper level. Even life itself, we can see, we begin from nothing, right? And then we're brought into something, and then eventually we go back into nothing. But then we're brought into life again, right? In this kind of cycle. And that's kind of how St. Augustine saw the entirety of the cosmos. And the key for the cosmos was this circle, which is so important, and this theme of exitus and reditus, of exiting and return. Now, St. Augustine kind of stole this philosophy from a Neoplatonic philosopher named Plotinus. And so Plotinus had this concept of God as the one, and that everything in reality emanated or flowed out from God. It kind of exited from God necessarily. It's like God was so big and powerful that things necessarily emptied from him, right? It's kind of like a fountain of being. And so this exiting wasn't sort of spreading out, but it was falling down, if that makes sense, right? So it wasn't equal. It wasn't like God was assimilating equally like a pantheistic God. He was becoming everything. No, it was simply that his essence was trickling down and manifesting itself in lower and lower ways. And so in Plotinus's worldview, there were a lot of these kind of pseudo-gods or pseudo-things that were above where we can see, like they were pure intellects, and they existed in a higher realm than we exist. And actually, matter for him was the lowest realm. Matter was the privation in and of itself. It was the last thing that the one emptied itself into. It was the final end, right? Like the end of all that empty. And so matter was viewed as evil. And the reason is because the one was pure intellect, right? And matter itself is unintelligible, right? Like matter, it has no principle of thinking. It's, in his mind especially, it was divided from thought, right? And so matter was evil. And the goal of life was then to escape matter through the mind and to return by ascension to the one. And so through the intellect, we ascended back to the one, and in doing so, found ultimate meaning and happiness. Now, how did this happen? Primarily in two ways. One was philosophy, but that only happened for those lucky enough to study it. And then two was what's called Gnosticism, which is an early church heresy that we had to fight for a very long time. And it's this idea of a liturgy purely in the mind, right, that kind of teaches you these secrets that allows you to ascend past the body by denying the body and simply accepting instead the spirit, right? Kind of denying the senses, denying our bodily appetites, and trying to ascend just with the mind alone. So dividing the body from the mind because they viewed that the body was evil. And this reditus, this return to the one through the mind alone, that was the beginning of religion for them, right? It was the beginning of Gnosticism, which itself comes from the Greek word for knowledge. And so it was all about escaping the body through the mind. And we see that revived today in a lot of, self-help meditation books, denying our senses, clearing our minds, and kind of getting out of our own bodies. But fundamentally, this is anti-Christian in its interpretation of exitus and reditus. And so for a more Christian understanding of exitus and reditus, we need to understand that the act of creation itself was not a necessary thing that kind of flowed from God. It was a completely free and good act. So everything exists insofar as God wanted it. He willed it to exist, not because it flows from some fountain of being, right? And so everything in the world is good, and that includes matter. And we've talked about how matter is a lesser good, yes, like things of the flesh are a lesser good than things of the spirit, but they're still intrinsically good. And that's why in our liturgy, again, we incorporate the senses, we incorporate matter into things. That's why we have iconography. That's why the crucifix hangs. It's because we understand that it's through the senses, which themselves are beautiful and good, that the Lord wants to speak to us. Because his exitus is pouring himself out completely in the lowest, which is our senses, so that then we can be returned to him. But our senses aren't intrinsically evil. They're just simply kind of the lowest means, the lowest good. And God's so powerful that he wants to make himself wholly known through our lowly senses. But our senses and our body are not evil, and they're not to be rejected. Instead, they're just to be ordered toward God. God created everything, and he wants to return everything to himself. This is the basis of St. Augustine's very famous quote, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." He wasn't just talking about this existential kind of angst of, I really desire heaven and I'm incomplete until I get there. He was kind of implying that, but he was really, I think, getting at this metaphysical truth, this truth of reality itself, that God has made everything and has declared it all good and has oriented it all to return to himself by coming down and incarnating himself in flesh, taking our nature, dying for us, extinguishing himself out fully upon the cross so that everything can be brought back to him. The whole world, the whole cosmos can be redeemed. Our reditus to God is only complete. Our return to God is only complete when it becomes part of the larger narrative of Christ's paschal mystery, which itself is expressed in the Mass through physical ways. And our reditus to God is only complete as well when it becomes part of the larger reditus of the entire church. When we submit ourselves in love, not just in the liturgy, not just here as a church community, but in loving service to our neighbor, right? The reditus of God is, again, we see the glory of God is man fully alive. The reditus of God is fully alive when man is giving himself bodily and mind in service, in love to God. And in that moment, he becomes a beautiful symbol that transcends mind and body of God's grace and goodness. And this is the basis for when Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI says, in spirit of liturgy, thus Christian worship is the practical application and fulfillment of the words that Jesus proclaimed on the first day of Holy Week, Palm Sunday, in the temple in Jerusalem. I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself. So God, in his act of pouring himself out completely on the cross, in the exitus of God, completely into death itself, in pouring himself out fully for us, he begins our reditus, our return all the way back to him. Because there was no way that we could have returned back to God through our own merits. So he had to pour himself out completely for us because of our sin. And this is how this exitus and reditus takes on a sacrificial nature as well, right? Not just a metaphysical, not just a psychological, but also a sacrificial nature. It's only through the exitus of God that we could be returned. And so it's only through our participation in that exitus and that reditus, right? In our death to sin, in our death to things of this world that hold us back, in our death to our old ways of thinking, into believing that we're damned or that we're not good enough, in our death to those things, right? In those things exiting from us, that then the reditus begins, right? And that our lives are incorporated into the greater paschal mystery of Christ. So this is the essence of the liturgy then, right? It's Christ pouring himself out into the last degree, into the lowest thing, right? Into bread, so that then we can receive him, and in doing so, we become part of the reditus, the return to God, which is always headed by Christ, which we in no way have merited on our own, but in which we participate by dying to our old selves and by embracing Christ in the paschal mystery. And so next time you're at Mass, really focus on the beauty of the fact that God has come down fully to bring us back up to himself. And that we, by no merit of our own, deserve this, but it's a free gift. And God wants us to accept that gift. And we express our acceptance of that gift in our psychological disposition in Mass, right? Of really praying and understanding what's going on. In our physical participation, of saying the words, of kneeling, of standing when we're asked to, of responding, right? And then ultimately, in assimilating that truth even after Mass, to where we begin to really act in love toward our neighbor. And in doing so, we bring about God's reditus for the world at large and become a symbol of his love and mercy for the world. The liturgy is amazing, and I hope you guys are beginning to see the beautiful depth that really is here, that instructs us on how to live and brings about our own redemption and sanctification. Thank you guys. Have a wonderful day.